We're going to look at another psalm this morning, and it's actually a continuation of the story that we were in last week. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question, and we're going to have a little congregational response here. How many of you had a good night's sleep last night? Okay, hold your hand up. Look around. Now, all those who are holding their hand up have no excuse for falling asleep this morning. So, what makes for a good night's sleep? Who can tell me?
Clear conscience.
Pardon? What makes for a good night's sleep?
Don't wake up.
Okay, you don't wake up. Okay. What else makes for a good night's sleep?
A clear conscience.
A clear conscience. Okay. What else?
No strife.
Okay. But how many hours of sleep makes for a good night's sleep? 7 to 8. Okay.
11.
Okay. Here's some things that maybe makes for a good night's sleep for me. Maybe a pleasant dream. I don't know what's a pleasant dream. It seems like all my dreams are kind of bizarre. I had a dream this week where I'm driving. I'm in some mountain range. And I stopped someplace, and all of a sudden, there's some people I haven't seen for years. And it's just bizarre. It seems like most of my dreams are bizarre. So, what makes for a good night's sleep? When you can't seem to sleep, what keeps you from falling asleep? Maybe if you're married, maybe it's your spouse snoring. Do you have that problem? Yeah. How many of you have that problem? Maybe it's drinking too much caffeine just before you go to sleep. Does anybody have that problem? For me, it's if I drink or if I eat too much chocolate just before I go to sleep, my heart seems to have, it pounds too much, and I can't sleep if I eat too much chocolate. I used to use a CPAP machine, and I could not fall asleep using a CPAP machine. If I have anxiety or worry or fear or something, or stress, I cannot fall asleep. Maybe it's knowing that I have to get up early, and I go to sleep going, oh, I know I got to get up early. I work part-time at the local YMCA, and I open the facility on Monday mornings and Friday mornings, and I have to get up at 3:45 in the morning. And if I don't get there at 4:30, well, then the building's not open, and the staff aren't there, the building's not open, and no one else is going to get in. So I lay awake going, well, if I'm not waking up, well, no one else is going to get in. So I don't get to sleep. So here's a few things that have helped me get to sleep. A routine. So going to bed at the same time has helped, but because there are days where I have to get up at 3:45, that's not always possible. Having a ritual, reading before I go to bed, or praying before I go to bed, listening to a short devotional, or listening to some contemplative music or devotional. Eliminating looking at a screen an hour before going to bed, TV, phone, or computer. But if anyone should have had a hard time sleeping or going to sleep, it was David. In Psalms 3 that we're going to look at today, David says in verse 5 of Psalms 3 an amazing thing. He says, I lay down and slept, I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. This is an amazing statement, seeing what was going on in David's life at the time. It was another time of turmoil. Life was out of control for David. It seems that the few times a psalm is identified with its context is a time of turmoil in David's life. And it's, if anyone should have had a reason not to be able to sleep, it was David. And David could say, I lay down and slept. So what was the context? David says this in Psalms 3. It was a morning prayer of trust in God. It was a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Remember last Sunday we looked at Psalms 51, and it was David's great sin against God. Through God's great mercy and grace, God passed over David's sin because of David's faith, just like God does our sin. But remember, there would be consequences. David was informed by Nathan the prophet that the sword would never pass from his house. What David had done in secret would be done in public with his concubines. That David's son would be killed. That there would be devastating consequences. And remember the story of what would happen. David had 17 sons. In Hebron, there was 6 sons born to him. And then in Jerusalem, there were 11 born to him. His first son, Amnon, had a crush on his half-sister, Tamar. And he had an inappropriate relationship with her. And Absalom, the brother of Tamar, kills Amnon. And Absalom then flees and goes into exile. And David does nothing. And Absalom flees to his father-in-law, who is the king of Geshur. And David does nothing. David's house is in turmoil. His house is falling apart. And Absalom is away for 2 years, and resentment builds in the house, and Absalom is gone. And finally, David invites Absalom to come back. And the resentment is building between Absalom and David. And when Absalom comes back, he begins to court the disgruntled people in Jerusalem and in the kingdom, in David's house, in David's kingdom. And Absalom begins to court and says that he would be a more sympathetic leader than his father David would be. And Absalom puts together a strong conspiracy and wins the hearts of the people of Israel. And David realizes that this is happening, and that Absalom wants not only to win the hearts of the people, he wants to actually kill David. And David realizes that he needs to flee. And he takes the people who are his supporters, which are in essence his 600 most loyal people, and the few other people with him, and he flees from Jerusalem. And he walks out of Jerusalem, and he walks out weeping, and he walks out barefooted, and he walks out with his head covered. And as he walks out wounded, he's met by a gentleman by the name of Shimei, who's a relative of King Saul, who curses David, and he throws stones at him, and he curses him, and he calls him a worthless man, and that David has brought his own downfall by being a man of blood. And the supporter of David wants to cut off Shimei's head, but David prevents him, saying maybe God has told him to say what he is saying, and perhaps the Lord will look on his affliction and return good to me instead of his cursing this day. Let me quote from a sermon entitled When Life Falls Apart. It was David's most traumatic, humiliating experience in his entire life. Everything he had spent his life working for had suddenly unraveled. Many whom he had thought were allies and friends had abandoned him and sided with his rebellious son. And the most painful wound of all was the treachery and betrayal of Absalom. It brought home David's own failure as a father. One son murdered, a daughter raped, and the murderer was now after his father's own life in addition to his kingdom. Life is falling apart for David. We may not have experienced the depth of the trauma David has, but life for each of us can fall apart. Maybe the loss of a loved one, a broken marriage in your family, a lost job, a devastating doctor's report, a wayward son or daughter. The list could go on. Life is not always easy. It is in the midst of this turmoil that David writes Psalms 3, a short 8 verses. It is a poetic prayer, and like the verses of a song, consists of 4 verses of 2 lines each. So let's look at those 4 verses. Verse 1. There are times of turmoil. So as a song, the first verse, which is verses 1 and 2 of the Psalms, says this: O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. They are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. David cries, O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Here David uses the word Adonai, translated Lord. O Lord. He uses the word Adonai. And the word Adonai is the meaning sovereign Lord. The 5 other times he uses the word in Psalms 3, he uses the word Yahweh. Yahweh is the personal covenant name of God. It has the same connotation as addressing God in the New Testament as Abba, Father. It is the personal cry for help. But here in verse 1, it is the meaning sovereign Lord. David acknowledges first that God is sovereign. His circumstances are not a surprise to God. God is aware of the circumstances that David finds himself in. In that, David finds assurance that God has not left him. I think David finds some relief, not in his own ability to change his circumstances, but God is acting as he told David he would. I think David, in the midst of his turmoil, sees the providence of God, that God is acting. If this turmoil had never happened, how could he trust God? God had said that it would happen, and now it is. As David looks at his life situation, his adversaries are real. They are increasing every day. They are rising up against him. They are not hidden nor afraid of David. David's very existence is threatened. They are rising up against him. They are not hidden nor afraid of David. David's very existence is threatened. They are trying to place doubt in David's mind that even God will no longer deliver him, that God has left him. Even in the midst of a turmoil we may find ourselves in, God remains sovereign. He is Adonai. God is sovereign. Our life circumstances are not a surprise to him. Prayer and addressing God begins with our acknowledging God as Adonai. That God is acting according to his will. Our enemy will do whatever he can to place doubt that God is not sovereign, that he has left us. You see, David's turmoil, I think, is a picture of Jesus' turmoil. As David leaves Jerusalem, he passes over the brook Kidron and ascends the Mount of Olives, weeping with his head covered and walking barefoot. Jesus, who on Palm Sunday would enter Jerusalem being praised, would in a few short days walk out of Jerusalem with his disciples up to the Garden of Gethsemane on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. There Jesus prayed in agony as he contemplated the day to come. So overcome by the horror of what he was to experience in the crucifixion the following day, his sweat was like drops of blood, and God sent an angel from heaven to strengthen him. David walked out of Jerusalem as a result of his sin. Jesus walked out of Jerusalem and up the Mount of Olives and eventually up Calvary because of my sin. David was not forsaken. Jesus was. Jesus was oppressed and he was afflicted. Yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before his shearers. So he did not open his mouth. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastising for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. Isaiah 53. How can a father do this to his son? In David's case, the son was chastising the father. For Jesus, it was the father towards the son, so that as Adonai, the all-sovereign Lord, holy and righteous, I could approach him through the Son, who interceded for my transgressions as Yahweh. Verse 2 of this song. In times of turmoil, God acts. There are times of turmoil. And in those times of turmoil, God acts. Verses 3 and 4. But thou, O Lord, art a shield about me, my glory, the one who lifts up my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. David says he is a shield. Not a defensive shield. He is a shield that wraps completely around. Will he not be a shield about me, surrounding me with his protection from our enemy? It is a shield that wraps completely around. As Charles Spurgeon said, "Oh, what a shield is God for his people. He wards off the fiery darts of Satan from beneath and the storms of trials from above, while at the same instant he speaks peace to the tempest within the breast." I think David understands that his greatest battles are the spiritual ones against the evil one. As God protects from without, he speaks within the heart of his children. It says, thou art a shield, the one who lifts up my head. He lifts up my head. David walks out of Jerusalem with his head bent downward, not because he's losing his kingship and kingdom. David's glory was not found in his position as king, for now his kingship was being taken from him. I think his head was bent down because of the shame and guilt of why this was happening, his sin. Only God could lift his head from sin. It's hard to lift your head above your circumstances when it is burdened and weighed down by guilt and shame. David's glory was found in his relationship with his Lord, Yahweh, Abba. Father. Even in the midst of his humiliation, David could say that God was lifting his head, and in that he could find rest. Have you ever felt the weight of shame and guilt? It is a burden too heavy to carry. People will try and deny shame and guilt and live through it, forget it, but it remains. David could only live above it when he allowed Jesus to carry it, and by so doing, he could lift his head. And then he says, he hears my cry. David says that he cries, that as he cries, God hears from his holy mountain. David's crying was not a single act, but was the habit of a man after God's own heart. Spurgeon said, we need not fear a frowning world when we rejoice in a prayer hearing God. God's holy mountain refers to Mount Zion in Jerusalem, where the Ark of the Covenant would remain as David fled. David tells Zadok the priest that if he finds favor in the sight of the Lord, then the Lord will bring me back again and show me his habitation. But if God should say, I have no delight in you, let him do to me as seems good to him. David's heart was humbled before God. If the Lord restored him, David would worship him. If the Lord didn't restore him, David would still bow before his just and holy ways. Even if he is separated from the symbol of God's dwelling place, the separation was no hindrance to his prayers. David didn't need to be at one place for God to hear him. Have you cried out to God lately? This chapter has meant a lot to me lately. I have spent more time crying because there has been some brokenness in my family. And I've cried to him. And in that crying, there's been nothing more meaning in my life than to know that God in his as Abba Father, that he hears. And he hears from his holy mountain. In times of, verse 3, in times of turmoil, God actions results in confidence. Verse 5 and 6. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Knowing that God is a shield, that he is the lifter of his head, David cries out in prayer, and in the turmoil of his circumstances, he lays down and sleeps, not to escape his reality, but in the confidence of his reality. In the midst of his trouble, God is sustaining him. What a picture of peace. I think it's the picture of Philippians 4, 6 through 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication. With thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I don't know if we can begin to understand God's peace, but it is real. God doesn't need to follow the 5 steps to get to sleep that I read in an article this week. He has a 4-step plan. He puts on the shield of faith, as Paul calls the shield of faith. Step 2, he releases trying to lift up your head on your own. He lets God do it. He prays, and he goes to sleep. When David awakens, the world has not changed. His enemies are increasing around him, but his confidence in God has not wavered. He has everything to fear, but his confidence in God, whatever the results is greater. What might be surrounding you today that might be causing you to lose confidence in God? The place to start is to cry. Ask for God to be your shield. Ask God to lift your head and to restore your confidence. In the final verse, in times of turmoil, acknowledge and live in God's victory, verses 7 and 8. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies on the cheek. Thou hast shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Thy blessings be upon thy people. In times of turmoil, acknowledge and live in God's victory. David claims God's victory as if it has already happened. Because enemies are rising against him, in verse 1, he asks God to rise and save him in verse 7. Though it has not yet happened in this circumstance, it has happened in the past. David has seen how God has handled his enemies over and over. God often through David has smitten them on the cheek and shattered their teeth. His enemies are like wild animals and have no power once their teeth are removed. And David acknowledges that God has the power to do it again if he so chooses. Salvation, deliverance will belong to the Lord and the Lord only. And God will get the praise. And David acknowledges victory as if it has already happened. The followers of David will be organized into an army, and they will defeat the armies of Absalom. And David will be reestablished as king over Israel. But a terrible loss to David. Against his will, his son is killed in battle. And David grieves more for the loss of his son than he rejoices in victory. He rejoices neither in his military might nor in his skill in battle, but he rejoices in God, who has proved not only victory militarily, but more importantly, victory in his own heart. He rejoices in his relationship with the Lord, that the Lord is a shield around his heart, the lifter of his head, and the hearer of his cry. You don't have to wait for a major turmoil to occur to know what David is saying. But it is good to know that when life does seem to be falling apart, I can lay down and fall asleep, waking up knowing God sustains me. This chapter again has been personal to me. David is restored. In 2 Samuel 21:22, there's an amazing verse. You know how many giants David killed in his life? And we hear the story of Goliath. But in 2 Samuel 21:22, you know, there's an account that there are 4 more giants that David, along with others, there are 4 more giants that David kills. David is restored. And that's what God does in our life. And that's what I believe God does for each one of us, as we allow God to be Adonai. He is the sovereign God in our life. And that we see God as Yahweh, our personal God, our Father, our personal God. May we allow Him to be faithful in the midst of the turmoil. And I look at my own life right now, some of the turmoil that I see God that's happening, and I don't desire it, but it's happening. But I desire to see God in the midst of that, work through it. And whatever turmoil there may be in your life, may you see God's faithfulness in that. And may you see God's hand through it. And may you be able to find peace and sleep in it.